The trough was down to its last 4 inches of water when Marion Castell heard the pump go silent. Not sputter, not groan. Silent. The kind of silence that meant something inside the well had simply given up. She was standing at the fence line, counting cattle, the way she did every morning before the heat came in hard, and for a moment she thought her ears were playing tricks on her. 30 years on this farm, she knew every sound the property made. She knew which board on the porch complained under a boot, which hinged on the barn door needed oil, and she knew, without needing to check, exactly what that pump was supposed to sound like at 6:15 in the morning. It wasn't supposed to sound like nothing. She walked to the wellhead fast, faster than her knees liked these days, and pressed her palm against the housing. No vibration. No hum, just warm metal, sitting still under a sky that hadn't given up a drop of rain in 6 weeks. No, she said quietly, to no one. Not now. Behind her, 31 heads of cattle were already drifting toward the trough out of habit, the way they did every single morning, expecting water that wasn't coming. Marion Castell was 44 years old, and she had inherited Holloway Ridge Farm from her father the same year her husband left for a job 2 states away and never quite found his way back. She didn't talk about that much. She talked about feed prices and soil moisture and whether the east field needed reseeding, because those were problems with solutions and the other thing wasn't. Her daughter, Wren, was 11, quiet in the way that made adults forget she was listening, and she noticed things, not because anyone taught her to. She just did. She kept a spiral notebook in her back pocket, half nature journal, half nonsense, sketches of beetles next to grocery lists her mother asked her to remember, and she'd been keeping it since she was 7, back when her grandfather was still alive and used to walk the property with her, naming things. That morning, Wren found her mother standing at the wellhead, with her hand still pressed flat against the metal, like she was checking for a pulse. "Mama?" "Well's dead," Marion said. She didn't sugarcoat things for Wren. Never had. "We'll figure it out." But Wren could hear the crack underneath the words, thin as a hairline fracture in a dry field. By noon, the diagnosis was from Grady Pell, the only well man within 40 miles who could get out that fast. He was in his 60s, sun-cured and unhurried, and he delivered bad news the way most men delivered weather reports. "Pump's shot," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Could be the motors seized from running dry too long during this drought. Could be the casings cracked further down. Either way, you're not looking at a repair, Marion. You're looking at a new well. How much? Depending on depth. 9, maybe 11,000. Marion didn't flinch outwardly. She'd learned a long time ago not to let numbers show on her face, in front of people who might use it against her later. But inside, something dropped the way a stone drops down an empty shaft. A long fall with no splash at the bottom, because there was nothing left down there to catch it. She had 4,000 in savings. The rest was tied up in a loan payment due at the end of the month, a loan she'd taken out 2 years ago to replace a hay baler that broke at the worst possible time. The way things on this farm always seemed to break at the worst possible time. "I'll figure something out," she told Grady, the same thing she'd told Wren. He looked at her for a second too long, the way people do when they don't believe you, but respect you too much to say so. "There's an emergency tank service," he offered. "Costs money, but it'll keep your stock watered while you sort it." "How much money?" "More than you want to spend on water you're only borrowing." That afternoon, the pressure got a face and a name. Del Van, who owned the neighboring spread and had been trying to buy the western 40 acres of Holloway Ridge for 2 years. He drove over in his truck, ostensibly to ask about a fence line, but Marion had lived next to Dell long enough to know an opening bid when she heard one. "Heard about your well," he said, leaning against his truck bed. "Rough time for it. We'll manage. You know I've got that spring-fed pond on my side. Been meaning to offer. If you're ever thinking about selling that western piece, I could work something out. Water access included. Save you the well cost altogether. He wasn't cruel about it. That was the thing Marion couldn't quite hate him for. Dell wasn't circling like a vulture. He genuinely believed he was offering her a way out. But it still felt like watching someone try to buy the ground out from under her while she was standing on it. "I'm not selling," she said. "Just an offer. The door's open." She watched his truck pull away and felt the walls of the problem close in a little tighter. A well she couldn't afford. Livestock with less than 2 days of stored water. A loan payment is coming due. And now a neighbor circling the one thing she had left that meant something. The land itself. It was Wren who noticed it first, 3 days into the crisis, while everyone else was too busy calculating gallons and dollars to look down at the ground. She was walking the fence line behind the old hay barn, the way she often did in the evenings when the chickens had already gone to roost and the light turned that particular gold color her grandfather used to call the good hour. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just walking, the way kids walk when their minds are somewhere else entirely. That's when she noticed the grass. A narrow strip of it, maybe 2 feet wide, ran along the base of the old stone fence behind the barn, and it was green. Not just green. Deep, stubborn green, the kind of green that hadn't existed anywhere else on the property in weeks. Everything around it had gone the pale, crackling gold of a summer with no rain. But this one strip refused to give up. She crouched down and touched it. Cool. Even with the sun beating down all afternoon, the soil under that strip of grass felt noticeably cooler than the dirt 3 feet away. She didn't know what it meant. But she pulled out her notebook and drew it anyway, a rough sketch of the fence line with a dotted mark where the green strip ran. At dinner she mentioned it. There's a patch of grass behind the barn that's still green, and the ground's cold there. Marion, exhausted, barely looked up from the stack of bills on the table. Probably just shade from the fence, sweetheart. Cooler spots hold moisture longer. It's not that shady, though. Wren let it go, but she didn't stop thinking about it. Over the next several days, while Marion negotiated a short-term deal with the emergency water hauler, a cost that made her stomach hurt every time the truck rolled up the drive, Wren kept walking that same stretch of fence line. And the more she looked, the more she found. She noticed that the cattle, when let out to pasture, kept drifting toward that same forgotten corner near the old barn, even though there was nothing growing there worth grazing. They'd stand near it, sometimes paw at the ground, then wander off confused when they found nothing. She noticed a scatter of old flat stones half buried in the dirt, a little further along the fence, arranged in a way that seemed too even to be an accident. Weather-smoothed, old. She noticed that where the green strip ended, near a cluster of scrub oak, the ground dipped slightly. A shallow, almost invisible depression that ran in a nearly straight line toward the lower pasture. She brought her notebook to her mother again, this time with 3 days of sketches. "Mama, look, it's not just one spot, it goes in a line, all the way past the oaks." Marion, worn thin from stress and a growing loan payment she didn't know how she'd cover, finally sat down and actually looked. And something about the straightness of that line, the way it defied the randomness of everything else on the drought-choked property, made her pause. "Get your boots," she said. "Let's go look." They followed the strip together in the fading evening light. Up close, it was undeniable, a corridor of healthier vegetation cutting through dead pasture, following a barely perceptible dip in the land, running from somewhere near the old barn toward the lower field where Marion's grandfather used to grow corn. "This wasn't here when I was your age," Marion said slowly. "Or, I don't remember it being here, I don't know. What if something's under it?" Marion crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the soil, the same gesture she'd made at the dead wellhead days earlier. This time, though, the ground felt different. Cooler. Slightly damp, even after weeks without rain. "There's something under here holding moisture," she murmured. "Has to be." That night, she went looking through the boxes of old paperwork her father had left behind. Deeds, receipts, faded photographs, searching for anything that might explain it. She found nothing specific. But in one photograph, black and white and curling at the edges, she saw her grandfather standing near the old barn with a shovel, decades before she was born, next to what looked like a shallow trench. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. The next morning, they dug. Marion started at the spot where the green strip was most vivid, just past the barn, sinking a shovel into dry, compacted earth that resisted every strike. Wren worked beside her with a smaller trowel, more out of determination than actual usefulness, but Marion didn't send her away. Some part of her wanted her daughter to see this, whatever it turned out to be. The first foot of soil was hard and lifeless. Then, unexpectedly, the shovel struck something that wasn't dirt. Stone. Marion cleared around it carefully, brushing dry soil away with her fingers, and found more stones beneath. Flat, fitted together with a precision that couldn't have been accidental. Beneath the stones, packed gravel. And beneath that, packed into the gravel, like a secret someone had tried to bury, a narrow channel, maybe 1.5 feet wide, lined with more stone along its base. The smell hit her before she fully understood what she was looking at. The smell of damp earth, real dampness, in a summer that had forgotten what rain felt like. "Mama," Wren whispered, "it's a ditch. Somebody built this." Marion sat back on her heels, breathing hard, staring at the buried channel like she was looking at a message from someone long dead. "Somebody sure did," she said. Over the following days, Marion pieced together what she could. She called her aunt, her father's last surviving sibling, and described what they'd found. Her aunt was quiet for a long moment on the phone. "Your grandfather used to talk about a water line when I was a girl," she said finally. Said his own father built it, some old system to catch runoff from the high ground behind the barn and walk it down to the cornfield, back before anybody around here had proper wells. I always thought it was one of his stories. Guess it wasn't. It made sense, once Marion understood it. The land behind the barn sloped down, gently but steadily, toward the lower field. A slope so gradual you'd never notice it just walking across it, but enough, over a long enough channel, to carry water by gravity alone. No pumps, no motors, just stone, gravel, and a slope someone had understood 100 years before anyone thought to measure it with modern equipment. The channel had likely been built to catch rain runoff from higher ground and deliver it slowly to the lower pasture. The ancestors' unpowered irrigation, quietly doing its job for decades, before decades of plowing and neglect buried it and let it fall out of memory. There wasn't a solution yet. It was buried, collapsed in places, and choked with root systems that had grown straight through it over the years. But it was something. Marion decided to try clearing it herself, section by section, rather than pay for equipment she couldn't afford. She and Wren spent an entire weekend pulling stone free, cutting through matted roots, hauling out decades of packed silt. By Sunday evening, they'd cleared nearly 30 feet of channel, and Marion, cautiously hopeful, decided to test it. Running water from a garden hose into the highest point they'd uncovered, just to see if anything would move. It didn't. The water pooled, sat stubbornly in place, then began seeping sideways into the surrounding dirt instead of flowing forward. Somewhere further down the line, the channel was blocked completely, and without knowing where, there was no way to fix it. Marion sat back on the ground, sweat-soaked and aching, and felt the exhaustion of the last 2 weeks finally catch up to her all at once. "Maybe it's not worth it," she said quietly, more to herself than to Wren. "Maybe we're chasing an old ditch that stopped working for a reason." Wren didn't argue with her. She just sat there beside her mother in the dirt, notebook in her lap, and started flipping back through her sketches. It was 2 days later, while going through her grandfather's old belongings again, that Wren found the thing that changed everything. A hand-drawn map, folded inside a farming almanac, sketched decades earlier in pencil that had faded to a ghost of itself. It showed the property boundary, the old cornfield, the barn, and a thin dotted line running not just from the barn to the lower field, but curving first past a stand of old oak trees Marion had always assumed were just decorative. "Mama, the line doesn't go straight. It bends. Right here." Wren tapped the paper. "By the big oaks." They walked out to the oaks together the next morning, and there, half hidden under decades of leaf litter and fallen branches, they found it. A second collapsed section of channel, packed almost solid with silt and roots, exactly where the old map said it would curve, before continuing on toward the field. This was the blockage, not somewhere they'd already dug, but a section they hadn't known to look for at all. Wren hadn't solved the whole problem, but she'd found the missing piece her mother needed. The restoration that followed took nearly 2 weeks. Marion worked in the cooler hours of morning and evening, easing roots out without collapsing the fragile stonework, resetting displaced stones by hand, reinforcing weakened sections with fresh gravel she hauled in a wheelbarrow from a pit on the property her father had used for decades. Wren helped where she could, clearing debris, holding stones in place, keeping a running log in her notebook of which sections were finished and which still needed work. There were setbacks. A section they thought was solid gave way again after a night of settling. Marion's hands blistered, then calloused. More than once, she wondered aloud whether she was pouring good effort after a fantasy, chasing a fix that belonged to a different century. But she kept going. Something about seeing her grandfather's handwriting on that old map. Something about the deliberate, patient stonework laid by people who never lived to see her stand in this field. It made stopping feel like a kind of quitting she wasn't ready for. The test came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the well first failed, when the sky finally broke. It wasn't a gentle rain. It came in fast and heavy, the kind of storm that usually did more damage than good on a drought-hardened farm, running straight off compacted soil, carving gullies, wasting itself in runoff that raced toward the road instead of soaking into anything useful. Marion and Wren stood under the barn overhang and watched. For the first several minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Rain hammered the ground the way it always did. Then Marion saw it. A thin, dark line of water forming at the highest point of the restored channel, near the old stone entry point behind the barn. It moved slowly at first, tentatively, like it wasn't sure the path was really open. Then it gathered, deepened, and began following the buried stone corridor, exactly the way it had 100 years earlier, down the gentle slope, around the bend by the oaks, and out toward the lower field. Instead of rushing and gouging the topsoil the way the open runoff was doing everywhere else on the property, the water in the channel moved with a strange, unhurried patience, spreading gently into the lower field soil instead of washing across the surface and disappearing. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. They just watched water do exactly what someone had designed it to do, 3 generations before either of them was born. "It's working," Wren finally whispered. Marion didn't trust her voice enough to answer right away. She just nodded, watching the dark, healthy stain of moisture spread slowly across ground that had been cracked and pale for over a month. The recovery wasn't dramatic. Marion made sure of that, at least in how she thought about it. She'd learned the hard way not to expect miracles from anything on this farm. The lower field greened up first, the corn stubble from a previous failed planting giving way to new growth within a couple of weeks. The cattle, no longer entirely dependent on the expensive hauled water, started drinking from a shallow catch basin Marion built at the channel's outlet, Not a full replacement for the well, but enough to stretch her tighter budget and buy time to save toward a proper repair. She still owed money. She still had a loan payment to make. Delvan still occasionally mentioned that his offer stood. None of the big problems disappeared overnight, but she wasn't drowning anymore. She was standing on solid, if still difficult, ground, and for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. One evening, weeks later, Marion walked out to the spot behind the barn where this had all started. The same fence line, the same patch of ground where she'd once stood with her palm pressed against a dead wellhead, feeling like the whole farm might slip out from under her. Now there was a soft trickle of water moving steadily along the restored channel beside her, cutting a quiet, patient line toward the lower field. Wren came and stood beside her, notebook tucked under one arm. "Grandpa knew this was here the whole time," Wren said. "We just forgot to ask." Marion looked out over the field, green in patches now, instead of uniformly dead, and thought about how close she'd come to selling off the land that held this secret without ever knowing it was there. "Some things don't need to be new to work," she said finally. "They just need somebody willing to remember them." They stood there a while longer, listening to water move through stone that had waited nearly 100 years for someone to notice it again. If you've ever walked a piece of old land and found something the years tried to erase, a forgotten wall, a buried structure, a strip of ground that just didn't match the rest, we want to hear about it. Tell us your story in the comments below, and tell us where you're watching this from tonight. It always means something to see how far these stories travel. If this one meant something to you, like the video and subscribe to the Farmland Files for more stories about the land, the families who work it, and the forgotten wisdom still waiting under the surface in fields just like this one. Share it with someone who'd appreciate a story about paying closer attention to the ground beneath their feet. You never know what they might be standing on top of.